Hej och välkomna till, hi and welcome actually, just today, to Jewish culture in Sweden, judisk kultur i Sverige och Konstakademin on this Swedish or Stockholm Book Weekend, which is concluding today, and we wanted to do something special on the occasion, also because it's the last event for the season for us, for very, very charged spring season, and now we're taking a break until August. And so we have been trying to invite Judy Batalion since the fall, actually. We started talking about it in August. We did an online program with her and with Sandy Bravarsky, but we couldn't find the time to bring her here. There was COVID, there was this, there was that. So we were so thrilled that we finally could bring her here now in May. As you know, poet Ilya Kaminsky was supposed to be here as well, but he got COVID. So it's still not safe to travel and to bring people from abroad. We had Pet and Nadash in February, and now Judy. We start very slowly with our international guests. But we are very, very happy to have Judy Batalion here with us. And we will have a discussion about her fabulous book, Våra, Dagars, Ljus, The Light of Days. So Judy, welcome to Stockholm. Welcome to us, to Jewish culture in Sweden. Nice to see you in person. And Svante Weiler is going to moderate this discussion with Judy. So welcome to take your space on stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. We start right away because there's a lot of things to discuss.
All right.
I think the book is how full of life this book is, though the theme is a bit sad, basically. But let's start. You are a 3G Jew from Montreal. That's how you introduced yourself to me. What's a 3G Jew from Montreal?
What is a 3G Jew from Montreal?
Well,
first of all, I have to say thank you. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day. Thank you for having me in this beautiful room in this beautiful city.
These nudes.
With all these nudes that I'm staring at now. You say, imagine your audience is naked here. I can't even believe I made it here in person. So much of my work is on Zoom. I'm not even used to talking about this book while wearing shoes, so it's very exciting, very, very exciting for me to be here. 3G from Montreal, what is that? A third generation Holocaust survivor. My grandparents, my mother's parents were survivors from Poland, from Montreal. I was born in Montreal, so that's the...
And brought up in English and, as you told me the other night, Yiddish.
Yes, I grew up speaking Yiddish. Yiddish, for those, any Yiddish speakers here? Oh my God, finally I found my audience. Ja, Yiddish is, bei ihm ist gewesen meine erste Sprache. Ich verstehe Yiddish, ich kenne Yiddish, ich rede Yiddish.
They spoke Yiddish all the time with you.
So I was really very much raised by my bubby, my grandmother, to whom the book is dedicated in part, and she spoke to me in Yiddish. So yes.
And being a 3G Jew, or 3G in Montreal, what kind of, this is what you start with in your book, what was your relation to the theme of your book, to the Holocaust? What sort of traces did that leave in you as a young girl growing up in Montreal?
Oh, that's hard. Okay, so you're asking me how I...
Yeah, what was your relation to these memories, to Holocaust? What as a young girl, somebody said, "Oh, the Holocaust. What makes that? What do you come to think of?"
I have to explain that the Montreal Jewish community is a very somewhat insular, a very self-contained Jewish community, largely because, especially at the time, it was an Anglophone, English-speaking community in French Quebec. So we used to joke, we had our shtetl in Montreal. And it was a high percent of the Montreal Jews were Holocaust survivors. So it wasn't unusual that I'm a 3G. All my friends, everyone I went to school with, one of their grandparents was a Holocaust survivor. So I grew up, I don't want to say, I grew up with the Holocaust as part of that's part of our story, part of our existence. And I went to a Jewish day school which we learned Holocaust literature as our primary literary curriculum. So I really grew up in a Holocaust community.
And was that a problem, or was it just like that?
It was just like that. As often when we're growing, I mean, I didn't grow up in another community.
No, but were you carrying a trauma? That's sort of kind of, were you carrying on? Were you told you have to carry this on? Our sorrows, our traumatic experiences? Or were you freer than that?
I don't think I was told I have to carry on the trauma. But I think I did carry on the trauma. But I think we're talking as a child, I didn't know that then. Of course, as an adult, looking back, yes, of course, I think very much we absorbed the, and every household is different and every family is different, but my family had a lot of difficulty and a lot of trauma, and I certainly absorbed that.
When this book starts, you're in London. It's a bit funny. Daytime, you're an art historian, and at night, you're a stand-up comedian, and you said, I used to be funny.
Let's
picture this art historian, daytime art historian, and nighttime or evening time stand-up comedy. Suddenly sitting in the British Library, ordering books about Jewish resistance. Women in Jewish. What did you say to the librarian? Could you bring me some books telling me the story of some Jewish women who resisted?
No. That's not.
How did it happen?
Okay. You're stealing all my lines, first of all. Now you're telling a story. What are you doing? So I was living in London in my 20s. And it was actually the year 2000. It was exactly 15 years ago. And I started to think a lot about my Jewish identity at that time. For the first time in my life, I was in a community that was not a very Jewish community, and that made me rethink my own family background. I was thinking about, as I said, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors from Poland, and I was thinking about this question of trauma. I was thinking about what I was calling the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way the trauma trickles between the generations. And I'm a very anxious person. And for the first time in my life...
What does that mean, concretely, a very anxious person? What are you afraid of?
Oh, gosh, what is it? This is like a whole psychoanalytic session.
Give us some examples, saying I'm a very anxious person. What does it mean?
You know what it means? It's like I walk down the street, I was just saying something, with my eyes bulging out, looking for danger.
That was you.
That still is me.
That still is you.
Yeah, I think I'm alert, I'm on the lookout, I'm waiting for the danger to drop. I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting for the moment. When do I need to go? When do I need to run? When is the danger? What?
How is that related to this project?
Okay, so I'm living in London and I start thinking about this element of my personality, and for the first time I wonder how much of that comes from my family background. And in a way it seems obvious, but at the time I didn't make that connection before. How much does my Holocaust heritage shape how I perceive how I react to everyday threats. And that's when I decided to write about this. And of course, at the time, I was doing a lot of performing. So this was going to be a performance piece. But not only did I do stand-up, I was also a historian. So I wanted this piece to have a strong historical backbone. So I was trying to think of a Jewish woman who had confronted danger. Who could that be in history? And I only thought of one person, Hana Sensch. And she's someone I had studied when I was in grade 5, 11 years old. And for people who don't know who she is, Hana Sensch was a Hungarian Jew. In the 1930s, she was a Zionist, and she made Aliyah, she moved to what was then Palestine. She was a poet, a lyricist, a playwright. But during World War II, Hana Sensch decided to fight back. She joined the Allied forces, she became a paratrooper, and she volunteered to return to Nazi-occupied Europe to fight the Nazis. She was actually caught very early on, but I'd always learned this legend that she looked her executioner in the eye when he shot her. I grew up with Hana Sensch as a symbol of Jewish courage. But back when I was writing this book, or wanted to write, I didn't know it was going to be a book at all. I thought it was going to be a performance piece. I didn't just want to know about Hana Sensch, the symbol or the hero. I wanted to really understand the person, because I was exploring this idea of danger. I wanted to understand who does that? Who chooses to go fight the Nazis? What poet decides to jump out of airplanes? What motivates that behavior, that courage, that gumption, that audacity? I wanted to understand her psychology. And that led me to the British Library, where I didn't talk to librarians. It was England, but I looked up Hana Sensch in the catalog. And there were not very many books about her at the British Library. So I just ordered whatever they had. And I went to you had to go pick up your stack of books, and I went to pick it up, and I noticed one of the books in the stack is unusual. It's an old book with dusty yellow pages and a blue fabric cover, and it's in Yiddish. It's called Frauen in die Ghettos, written in embossed gold on the front. Women in the ghettos. But as I always say, even more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I start looking through this book, flipping through it, looking for Hana Sensch, which is who I came to research, but I can't find her in the book. It turns out she's only in the last 10 pages in a 200-page Yiddish book. In front of her are 185 pages with stories of dozens and dozens of other young Jewish women who fought the Nazis, and primarily from the ghettos and a bit from the forests in Poland. And there are photographs of these women and bios and excerpts and memoirs and letters, and it's almost like a scrapbook of stories with chapter titles like Ammunition, Partisan Combat. There was an ode, a poem praising guns. And I actually thought maybe my Yiddish was rusted. Was I translating this correctly? Because this was shocking to me.
And it was written when?
This book was published in 1946. And I'd never, ever heard stories. These were stories of young Jewish women and teenage girls who were jumping off trains, who were blowing up trains. And I had never heard
Do you still remember the feeling while reading about them? How you felt sitting there in the library, getting these stories told to you by them? So.
Really what strikes me, and I think meant when I opened this old book, Frauen in die Ghettos and series, I anticipated a sorrowful reflection on the women of the ghettos. And instead, This book was so angry. These women writing, they were furious. They were furious at what was happening. They were at what had happened and what was happening, depending on when the excerpt was from. And that is what I think, as much as the content, that tone, I'm getting shivers now. I mean, that really, it came alive for me. That their experience of their emotions was so robust on the page. And then I felt them. I felt their presence.
Could you at that time imagine that this would be something that would occupy your mind and your body and everything else for 12 years?
15 years now.
15 years. Or what did you see in front of you, saying, I'll translate some of these and show them to my friends in Montreal? Or did you see this book already then?
Oh, no. This idea for this book came 10 years later.
Wow, what happened first 10 years?
What happened the first 10 years? So I saw this, and I knew, I saw this material, and I knew I had to do something with this material. People, did you choose this project? No, the project chose me. Like in Yiddish we say, "Es hat mir gehabt." Like I was caught in this. And to be totally honest, it was with some ambivalence. Because it wasn't like, oh, look at this amazing story, now I have to go write this. It was like, wow, look at this amazing story. Oh, now I have to go write this. Because at the time I was young, I was funny. I didn't want to spend my days in Warsaw in 1943. I had spent a lot of my life running away from the trauma in my family. And so it took me a long time to really commit to writing this further. But in those first years, but the thing is, there are many times where I gave up the project. I said, I can't do that, I can't work on this, I can't do it. But I always came back to it.
And we're thankful for that. Let's just jump into the book,
yes.
Because you brought, there's a wonderful section of photographs in the book from the time. And you brought some of them with you. So I think we'll talk about the book and the people in the book, the heroines in the book, by showing them here, so people, so you can see them. So why don't you take that thing and start pointing, and let's see what's happening up here.
Right.
What's that?
What is this? So this is a picture of Fromka Plutnitzka, and she's second on the right with the amazing fur collar. And I feel close to Fromka in this writerly or I don't know, spiritual way. So I'm going to start with the story of Fromka. Fromka was born in Pinsk. She comes from a very religious family, but she herself was very intellectual, socialist, Zionist, and she became involved in the youth movement scene in Poland, which was very big in Poland at the time. I can talk.
This is before the war.
This is before the war. This picture is Bialystok in 1938, and she is posing with her youth movement group. She was part of the group Dror, or Freedom in English. I don't know in Swedish. And she was a leader in Dror. She was, in fact, a leader of the Zionist socialist youth movements in all of the country. 100,000 young Jews were members of these youth movements. It was very widespread. These were like the Scouts, but more intellectual, social, emotional, spiritual training grounds.
And Jews were not allowed in the Scout movement.
So part of this was they created their own movements. These movements were affiliated with the Jewish political parties in Poland. You had communist, right-wing, Zionist, anti-Zionist, Yiddishist, Hebraicist, religious, anti-religious, and every combination. And they had these youth movements. And the movements I write about, and Fromka was part of, were socialist, secular movements. They talked a lot about their leadership structures, their relationships to each other. They were about helping the community, self-sufficiency. They were egalitarian to some degree, women were leaders in these movements in the 1930s. They believed very strongly in Jewish history, Jewish culture, even though they were not religious. And also they took care of their community. There were kibbutzim or communes all over Poland. And young Jews used to go live on these communes and study the ethics of the movement and the philosophies of the movement, and they got to know each other very well. And I mention all this at length because these youth movements were what became the fighting groups in the ghettos many years later.
That was a kind of condition. The persons you follow, they were almost all of them were organized before the war.
Yes.
They had political experience.
Yes.
Was that a kind of a precondition for making this choice, becoming a resistance fighter? That you brought something with you?
Well, these were groups that knew each other. So, and in the ghettos, many of them already lived together in the ghettos. So they were from these, value-driven groups that really believed in Jewish dignity and pride and helping the community and acting. And they were social action groups. So yes, that's how they went on to form these undergrounds in the ghettos.
What happened to Fromka?
Okay, coming back to Fromka. So Fromka was a leader in Warsaw. She was 24 years old when Hitler invaded in 1939. And the movement told everyone, flee east, go east, go east. This is also how my grandparents got out of Poland. So Fromka made it across the border near her family in Pinsk. She was at the time, Russia territory was relatively safe, and she couldn't take it. She couldn't take having fled. And so she was the first person in this large movement structure who smuggled herself back into Nazi-occupied Poland, and she went to Warsaw, and she became a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto. She ran soup kitchens for hundreds of Jews. She gave lectures, seminars, ran performances. She negotiated with Jewish, German, and Polish officials. She helped extricate young Jews from forced labor. They called her, in the ghetto, they called her Die Mame, Yiddish for mom. She had a very Jewish countenance, but she used to put a kerchief over her face, and she put on makeup, even though she wrote about it, she didn't believe in makeup. But she put on makeup.
Believe in makeup.
Yes, her social is very strong. And she put on makeup, and she would slip out of the Warsaw Ghetto. And in 1940 and 41, for 2 years, she toured Nazi-occupied Poland, giving seminars in the ghettos in Poland, still teaching about socialism, Zionism, morale, spirituality, and she kept the movement connected. She kept the young Jews connected.
She never thought of running away, leaving the country, because she had apparently the possibility, since she could travel in the country in disguise.
She came back.
She never thought of leaving.
No, never.
Was that something that she had in common with the other of your heroines? They never thought of leaving, even if they had the possibility.
Some of them did not have the possibility. So it's not the same for everyone, but especially for the beginning of the war. After some time of fighting, after losses both physical and spiritual, then there came a point where people said, we got to go. Let's find escape routes out of Poland. But for the first years of the war, no, they didn't know. She came back to be with her people.
Let's move to the next picture, because there's so much to talk about. There are some.
Wait, I have to finish from.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
So she was one of the first people to smuggle weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. She brought 2 guns in a sack of potatoes. She was then they sent her to the town of Bejin, where it's in southwest Poland, where she led the underground. She planned a revolt, and she was killed shooting Nazis from a bunker during the liquidation of the Kamyanka Ghetto in 1943. She was 29 years old, and after the war, she was awarded a medal, an Order of the Cross, by the sort of makeshift Polish government of the time for her service defending Poland against the Nazis.
Wow.
And I'd never heard of Fromka Plutnitzka. And part of me, I sometimes feel like the granddaughter she never was able to have, because I feel like if I don't tell Fromka Plutnitzka's story, who will? So that's part of what kept me going. Anyways, you asked me to move on. Sorry, I can talk a lot, as you can see the thing.
I
Okay.
have to go through.
Okay. I told him to tell me.
That's the big heroine of the book, Renya, isn't it?
Renya's the central figure in the story. And Renya's a little different. She came from a more middle-class family, also, quite religious, but more into modern art, literature, from a small town near Krakow. And Renya went to public school, was the top student in her class. She became a stenographer, and she started working in the town's court. She was 15. And
She went to Polish school, not to Jewish school.
she went to Polish public school,
Yeah.
like most
Why?
of these.
Why wasn't she sent to a Jewish school?
So this ends up playing into the resistance as well. Women's education, not just in the youth movement, but in school. So education in Poland was mandatory for boys and girls through 8th grade. This is in the 1930s. But in many Jewish families, they sent their sons to a private Jewish school. But to save on tuitions, it wasn't so important for girls to have a religious education, so they sent them to public school. And in these public schools, girls became more assimilated, basically, than their brothers. So you had this kind of semi-generation of girls who were more acculturated than boys. And these women, this then goes on to help their work.
Because it
The
turned out to be very
underground.
useful to be assimilated if you wanted to go.
If you wanted to
Undercover
pretend not
in
to
the
be
Polish
Jewish,
society.
it became very useful to speak Polish like a Pole, which they learned, to have an awareness of Polish literature, Polish language, Polish customs, the nuances of behavior. This is what I always say.
Even Catholic religion, how they prayed.
Even
You
if
write
she
about
did-
in
she
the books
didn't-
that they
yeah,
were good at, they had to attend services because they pretended to be Catholics.
They would copy and
Yeah, and they had to go to service, and then you have to know how to pray, not the Jewish way. So how did they do that? Did they just copy the Poles?
yes. So
Looking at that, that's how they fold their hands, that's how they,
Yes.
now on your knees.
yes, they write about this, that they would pick specific people to stand behind in church so that they knew certain people. They're like, oh, I'm going to just copy everything that she does. With Renya writes about this, sweating and terrified, but having to do.
And Renya was good at that. Where is this picture from? Where is it taken?
This picture is in 1944. This is taken in actually Budapest. She ends up leaving Poland. I gave it away now. She's pretending to be Christian, still in Budapest. This is right before the Nazis occupy Hungary, but still she's pretending to be Christian.
She's on her way out to Palestine?
Yeah.
Yeah. What made her go to Budapest? What did she do before?
Okay. So rewinding. So
Rewinding.
So Renya, she was 15 when Hitler invaded, and she was defiant from the start. She would sneak out of the ghetto to trade family heirlooms for food. A number of children did that, and she felt very responsible to feed her parents and her siblings. She had 6 siblings. And in 42, in the summer, her family knew they were going to be killed. And they decided to split up whatever money they had and flee. And she went by herself. Her brother was in a slave labor camp, and she escaped from the ghetto and went there. Anyways, they let her in. She stayed. Then one morning, they woke her at 4 a.m. They're saying, we're sending all the women to Auschwitz at 8. And they liked her, so they said, get out of here now. So then this began her years of what she called it her wanderings, fields, forests, trying to hide in a family friend in the cupboard, and people giving her. She was once on a train, and someone from Yenstochov recognized her, and she knew she was finished, and she picked up her bag and walked to the end of the train and jumped off. She eventually got a job, she found as a housemaid for a part German family, and that's when she was insisting on going to church and copying everyone. But she really missed her older sister, Sarah. So she managed to connect with Sarah through a still functioning postal system. And Sarah was living in Beijing. Sarah was part of the underground. And Sarah sent a smuggler to collect her. And so one day she left the family and went to Beijing. And when Renya got there, the underground in Beijing, which was being run by Fromka, was planning an uprising. But they needed more weapons, instructions, and supplies from Warsaw. So all the couriers who had been going back and forth had been killed. And they asked Renya, she was 18 at the time, and she looked good, they used to call it. It meant she had a more Aryan look. And so they asked her if would she do it. She had no political experience at all. But she said, yes, of course I'll
Why
do
did she say yes?
So she writes about this and talks about this.
Because she survived, so she's one of the contributors to the book Freud in the Ghetto.
Yes,
Yes.
she was the longest contribution in Freud in the Ghetto.
So why did she say yes? What made her not being anxious?
Fury.
Fury.
The fury at the injustice of what was being done. And also she talks about how she wasn't afraid for her life because she knew her life could end at any second. And so there was nothing to fear, she felt. And she was so furious.
This was kind of another condition for these young women. Almost every one of them lost their family.
Yes.
They were alone in the world. They were between 18 and 20, 22. They were alone in the world. They had nothing to lose in that sense. Was that sort of something that the resistance movement, the Jewish resistance movement, the Polish, sort of they aimed at these young orphaned children? Or was that just they didn't have anything else to do than fighting?
Well, these young children were the resistance movement. So it's not like there was someone recruiting them. Mm-hmm. But I think that what happened was for many of them, they were suffering tremendous grief. And for those who were able to turn that grief into anger, and to survivors and fighters who I spoke with, that anger helped propel them, helped them survive, helped them get through. Mm. And I think that was her experience.
You met Renya's daughter in Israel, didn't you? Or was it the granddaughter?
I've met several of her family. I met her daughter, her son, and more recently her granddaughter.
What did they tell you about Renya?
So Renya was a courier.
Jump. We will come back to.
Okay, we're coming back.
But that's a jump. I want to know what story did they tell you about Renya?
So when I met with families, I did not ask them for the war story. I took that from these women's own writings and testimonies and words. When I met with families, I came with a long list of questions, but my questions were about their personalities. My questions were, what was Renya like? What did she eat for breakfast? What were her hobbies? What was she, tell me the funniest story about her. And I wanted to fill out their personality so that then I could go back and understand their war story in a more multidimensional way as well. So Renya's family is a great question. I'll tell you a few anecdotes they told me about her. They told me, first of all, she loved fashion. Fashion, lipstick, she had matching lipsticks, bags, and outfits, and this was
She believed in makeup.
She believed in makeup, and that plays into her role, which we'll come back to. She also, they said she was very funny, she was very optimistic, she traveled the world, she was in Alaska in her late 70s. They told me that when it was time for her to move into a senior living facility, she didn't want to go. So she made all her friends move there first. And then once she had a lot of friends there, then she moved.
She kept on organizing life.
Yes, she organized everything. And she was always the star of the show. They said she was extremely, extremely committed to family, and her husband, who she ended up marrying, died many, many years before her. She was a widow for a long time, and she never dated. They told me she had men all over her all the time. She never dated anyone. That was, she felt so committed to her husband and to family.
Did she keep her anger alive, or did she stop being angry after having survived and come to Israel?
They do not know her as an angry person at all. They talk about her as a very jubilant, comedic person.
Pretty free person in a sense, then freed of the anger that made her resist and made her smuggle all these weapons and made her sort of survive all these life-threatening situations that she were in. Was that something you saw with the other survivors, that they also got rid of their anger? Or was it different?
The last section of the book is all about what happened to those who survived, not just how they survived, but how they kept on surviving. What happened? I was very interested, because of my own family, what happened to them after the war. And I found it was really mixed. Mm-hmm. There were some women, like Renya, who were able to move on. It was always there, but their day-to-day was joyful and beautiful and vibrant. And then there were others who were very traumatized and who even years after the war committed suicide. Mm-hmm. So there was really a wide range of responses.
Let's move on to the next photo you have.
Oh.
This is so special. You really would like to ask the audience, where do you think this is taken, and tell them.
This is a photograph of 3 young Jewish women in the underground, pretending to be Christian. This photo was taken at the Nazi Christmas party in Grodno in 1941.
They're celebrating Christmas together with the perpetrators.
Yes, because Bella Hazan, the woman on the bottom, she's living a secret life in Grodno. She has set up a sort of safe house for the underground there, and she's a young woman. She had to get a day job. Interviewed for a job. Oh, we have the perfect job for you. You could work for the Gestapo. She becomes their receptionist, translator. She brings them tea. She also steals their documents, stamps, passports, travel papers, visas, and brings them to the Jewish forgers to copy them for Jews. She smuggles guns. She smuggles bulletins. She braids them in her hair. There's a lot of stories about that. But one of the men in the office develops a big crush on her. And
you can understand that.
She's apparently very attractive, and he invites her to the Christmas party. And she can't say no. I mean, everything has to be, she's living this, constant act. She lived on the outside. She lived on the Aryan side. She lived, a life or death acting job with no intermission. And she had to be flattered that he invited her to the party. Just so happens that night, Tama Schneiderman and Lanka Kazabrodska, 2 weapons couriers, are staying in the safe house with her. And
so she just brings them along. It's a nice Christmas party. Why don't you come along?
She told the landlady these are her cousins. Mm. So they said, her cousins are in town. Now they have to go to the Christmas party. They even had a fake Christmas tree. She writes about buying the tree. Like everything was a performance.
What was the cost of acting like this? Because almost all the women you write about, they were acting, especially those going in and out of ghettos, doing all the courier services. What was the cost of acting?
It's a great question, so I read a very interesting piece about how it was analyzing people who are passing as Christians, and it was saying that for those who had a moment to share their true identity, it was easier. for those who were constantly performing, constantly acting, who never had the backstage, who could never take off the makeup or the wig for 1 minute, that was a harder experience. For those who went back into the ghetto, who had maybe knew even someone who knew who they really were, that was easier. And in Bella's story, because of this photo, she ends up getting caught. And
How?
so the Gestapo.
Tema is...
Oh, sorry. The Gestapo gives them each a copy of. This is part of the Christmas thing, to get copies of these photos, and Lonka carries hers with her, and she's caught. She gets out of so many, incredible stories, but at one point she is caught. Now, they don't know that these women are Jewish. When they're caught, the Nazis think they're part of the Polish underground. They still pretend. So she's jailed at Pawiak prison in Warsaw, political prison, not as a Jew, as a Christian. But then Bella is doing a mission transporting guns, and they find the photograph on her. They search her, and they find the photo. She also had the photograph, and she's caught because they say, "Wait a minute, your friend in the underground, in the Polish underground, had the same photograph. Oh, we found you." So they had found her from that.
We have to talk about this weapons smuggling. One of the striking things with your book is that it seems to have been, it seems to me that there existed structures, really structures, providing people with weapons, money floating in from abroad, buying the guns, buying stuff, and then getting all these guns and all these weapons into the ghettos. I didn't know that. Did you know that before you started studying all these structures, all these?
So first of all, it's not
well-organized.
It's not like there's 1,000 weapons. They were joking at one point their whole weapons cache fit in a bicycle basket. So there weren't. At some point that once in Warsaw they got a big shipment, but like 100 guns. So it wasn't like huge amounts of weapons. Did I know this? I couldn't. I absolutely did not know this. I had heard of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I didn't know that any details, is the truth. I had no idea that over 90 European ghettos had armed underground.
90 ghettos had armed underground. And what do you mean by armed underground? Somebody carrying a gun, or?
Yeah, a couple of guns. It depends. Vilna had a bigger armed gun. It depends on the ghetto. It depends on the thing. But a number of guns, explosives, weapons, and an organization to resist.
And in your book, you talk about women in these ghettos killing Nazis, just being on missions, shooting, sort of sent out, or was that their job, sort of kill as many Nazis as you can?
So
must have been extremely dangerous.
Usually there were the military, the guerrilla kind of plan was, and this happened after much trial and error, was that they waited until the Nazis were coming to liquidate that ghetto, kill all the Jews, and that's when they would launch their attack. And women, in particular, women did have guns. Many women were throwing Molotov cocktails or other explosives. That was often, in particular, in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But Fromka was, but a mix, yes. So they were.
Tell us about the role of women in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That was something that struck you. You write about it, that they played such an important role.
So
in the uprising.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, I had no idea what it really was, despite my Holocaust background. It was about 700 young Jews, average age 20, maybe, who, it was a very organized effort, and each fighting group was the youth movement group. So, Dror had their fighting group, Hashomer Hatzair had their fighting group, the Bund had their fighting groups, but they were all eventually connected, except for the right-wing groups that never connected with the left-wing groups, and they fought separately, and it's actually a fascinating and tragic story. But the groups, and about 200 of the fighters were women. Of that
One third,
group.
more.
About a third.
About a third.
Yeah. And women were also involved in organizing it. For instance, Zivia Lobetkin was a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, strategizing it, commanding it, and fighting with a gun and fighting from rooftops.
And there was not they played an equal role with the men. Was that because they had this egalitarian background in the youth movements?
So for the most part, there was, they played, I wouldn't say equal, I would say that, yes. So first of all, in the 30s, women were leaders in these movements. So it wasn't unusual to have a woman running a military effort. Also, women played particular roles in the underground because it was easier for them to pretend to be Christian. One of the reasons, as we mentioned, their education. Also, women weren't circumcised. And also, no one expected women to be walking around with a handbag full of ammunition. And they played to that. And one of my favorite stories is about Lanka, who's wearing the brooch here. And she one day, she has a bag full of contraband material. She's going to the train to deliver, and they're searching all the bags. And what is she going to do? And so think fast. She goes up to the Gestapo man. She says, "Oh, my bag is so heavy. Can you carry it for me?" And he said, "Of course, I'll carry it for you." And he puts it on the train, and no one searches that bag. And that story happens, time and time again. So for many reasons, it was easier for women to do this work on the outside. So often it was women that did that, whereas men tended to be more based in the ghetto and working from the ghetto.
I know there's a question rising among the audience, why haven't we heard as much of this before? But we'll keep that question waiting a little bit. Take the next photo. Who's this and where?
This is Vladimira Mead, and this photo is taken in central Warsaw in 1944. And she is pretending to be an upper middle class Christian young woman. She was about 22, I think, at the time. And out for a day of shopping, theater.
That smile of hers, is that acting?
Of course it's acting. It's Warsaw in 1944. That was part of it.
There was nothing to smile about, really.
But you had to smile.
You had to smile.
Oh, and you had to have, you couldn't have, they wrote about this all the time, Jewish eyes. You had to be happy. You had to look up.
And she knew everything about the Holocaust at the time. Perhaps not the exact number of people, but she knew they're killing all of us.
Yes,
and
this
she's
is
walking
44.
the streets of Warsaw with that smile on her face.
Yes.
Yeah. What was she doing at the time? What was her mission?
So at this time, there was no more Warsaw Ghetto. She had been the one to bring dynamite into the Warsaw Ghetto for the uprising. She spooned it through a hole in a basement wall. But at this time, there was no more ghetto. The ghetto had been razed. And she worked for an organization that helped over 10,000 Jews who were hiding in Warsaw at the time. And she basically found them hiding spots, would move them when the spots became compromised or too uncomfortable. She would bring them medical help with trusted doctors, photographers to take pictures of them for fake IDs, books, paper. Some people hid in very difficult conditions. She tried to provide some, spiritual, something for them to do. The women they write about, they would walk through Warsaw with these bags full of money because they were paying off.
Is that what she's carrying there?
I don't know,
Might be full of money?
It might be. And they wrote about how terrified they were. But someone found them with a bag of money.
Did she survive the war?
She survived the war and went on to be a main person who established the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And I just had lunch with her son, so.
Wow. Well, that's very good. But next photo, because there's something else that I know attracted you. This is also Warsaw, isn't it?
This is Warsaw in 43. And these are two Jewish women. This is June 43. Hela Shuper and Shoshana Longer, and they were leaders in the Krakow underground. Hela Shuper, she's the one on the left. She was known at the time as a beauty. She'd gone to business school. She was the main weapons obtainer for the war, for the Krakow underground. She tells stories. She would have a person she was supposed to meet from the Polish underground, a Mr. X. She would, they had code words. What time is it? 15. And they would have the word. She followed him at a distance, and then eventually he would come out and something like 5 pounds of explosives, 7 guns, pounds of cartridges, and she would get on the train and bring it back to Krakow. And the Krakow underground in 42 at Christmas, they actually blew up a Nazi Christmas party, and I never knew that.
Especially in the next photo, that was the photo I thought about. No, maybe you have to tell them the story about this.
So this is one of Vladimira Mead's fake IDs. Fake IDs this was a culture of ID. IDs were extremely important, and I got into the weeds in the research a bit. There were all kinds of different types of fake IDs and how they were procured, how they were made, how they were purchased. This was the best kind because this was a real Polish ID, but her photo, she put her photo on it. So the photo of the original person, but then it was the best kind of ID because it could be traced and tracked, and it didn't look like a phony. But on the other hand, you then had to become the person on this ID. Her name, Vladimira Mead's name, is Fagi Peltel. She became Vladka from her ID, and that became her name for the rest of her life.
She kept that name.
Of course, everyone knows her as Vladka. That was from her fake ID. This is one of her IDs, but I was showing it to you because if you look at the red stamp in the top left corner, so someone's job, they had to make it so that it attached perfectly to the original stamp because that's her photo that's pasted on. So it had to be perfectly, symmetrically contiguous with the original stamp.
And you can imagine her fright every time she had to show it. She was afraid that somebody would see this is fake.
And you had to show ID constantly, all day. People were asking for the IDs. Yeah.
Now the next photo, because that's, you have to tell the story about her. She is a famous person as well.
This is Witka Kempner. Witka, look at her. Here she is with, a gun. I think this was 44. She was in the Vilna underground. And then she led a partisan group in the forest near Vilna. She was 19 when the war started. The Jews in her town were locked in the synagogue, and she escaped out of a window in the bathroom and ran, basically made it to Vilna, joined the underground. They always write about her, she looked very Jewish. She didn't care. She tried to dye her hair, and it never worked. It was always too red. They had to keep going to different barbers. But she was in the underground from day one, and she was very small, so she used to sneak out of the Vilna ghetto by fitting through a slat, like in a fence. And they gave her the mission to blow up a train. And this was, and she went every night. She snuck out of the ghetto to find the best spot to put a bomb. It had to be somewhere where it would cause maximum disruption. It couldn't be too close to the ghetto because they didn't want to blame the Jews for it. There'd be retribution. But it had to be close enough that she could go back and forth. And she found this spot, and one night she leaves the ghetto with a couple of other Jewish kids. They're teenagers in the underground. They had a bomb. Her closest friend for her whole life was the woman, Vitka's on the left, the woman in the middle, Rushka Korzak, also a leader in the Vilna partisans and in the Vilna ghetto. And Rushka had found a pamphlet about how to make bombs in the YIVO library in Vilna. She was a book smuggler. She was trying to keep, and she brought this pamphlet to the underground, and they made these makeshift bombs, and Vitka slipped out with a bomb and blew up this train.
But it's more to the story because you said this is the first train that was blown up.
Yes. And this
and
this became a regular act of partisan warfare, but she was the first one, and she was a 19-year-old Jewish girl.
Have you? Did she survive to tell the story herself, or was she?
Yes.
And how does she tell the story? Saying, "Well, just like that. Well, they gave me a bomb, and I had to go out and blow the train." Or does she tell anything about how it felt doing it? Being afraid or not being afraid, being having the mission of her life, or how does she describe such a deed?
So she talked very little about herself in the war, but others have written a lot about her. And of course, I've met with her son, who is an artist. And by the way, she became a child psychologist most of her life. And lived a very long life, died in her 90s in Israel. Someone asked her in an interview I came across many years, from the 90s, I believe, did you feel bad? You killed Germans, And she answered, in war, you do what you have to do.
She was a warrior, really. She sort of adapted to that.
She had real gumption. I mean, her son said to me, he said, Judy, she had a goyish temperament.
There's nothing to say
I'm
about
just
that.
saying, that's what it said.
The next photo, I'm looking for another one because I know that one and then that.
Oh.
Back to that one. Because you're really interested in how they appeared, how they looked, what they wore, what kind of person they were. When you saw this picture, it didn't fit with your previous image of a Polish Jew in the 30s.
So this is Renya's older sister, Sarah, who got the smuggler to bring her to Bijan. This I want to show that so women had their hair cut short, they wore red lipstick, hair pulled back, fitted blazers, they were shorter skirts. I found a satirist at the time wrote, oh, you could see the whole shoe. They wore clothes, this is in the 30s, that enabled them to run. They were physically, the fashion of the time was women could move physically, and that became very important. And so that's why I sometimes show this picture, because had it been a few decades earlier and dresses would have been there, and they couldn't have done the same kind of work. These women were jumping over roofs. They had lower heeled shoes. They walked a lot. They wrote a lot about that. And then this is another picture. This is Paula Ulster. This is her photo from the 30s. She became a huge she was an activist in the 30s. She actually went to jail for being in the Communist Party, and then was very involved in the underground. And this was one of her school photos from the 30s. I mean, this was not what I expected Jewish women to look like in Poland in the 1930s.
This is interesting because it seems to me that you carried, as many of us then, so having this notion of so many people becoming victims, you sort of in your mind, like, this is something I came to think about. You try to look for something in there, how they look in the 30s. This is how you see they're becoming victims. But you saw something else. You saw them as
I saw them as contemporaries. I saw them as people that look like, was it the next one that we were looking at? I mean, look, I have that jacket, And I mean that. I mean, it was these stories, the photographs, the testimony. Suddenly, these were not just figures. These were not just abstract, historical. These looked like my friends, and that was very powerful and very moving for me, and it shifted that, and also they had many emotions. It wasn't just sad. They were angry. They were happy. They were mad. They were sad, but they were suddenly full people to me. And I wanted to convey that too.
We could go on forever because there's so many more heroines in the book, but there's a big question. In the subtitle of your book is The Untold Story, or The Untold Stories about the Jewish resistance women. This is a short question to big. Why were they untold? Why have they stayed untold so long?
So I give a 1-hour lecture on this subject.
Yeah, but
so
give us a
I'm
short
going to give you a
version.
short version. So first of all, there are two histories here that have been repressed, I think, that intersect in this story. One is the story of Jewish resistance in the Holocaust, in particular in Poland. And the other is women's experience in the Holocaust. And here you have both. And they've both been, I think, underreported for many, many different reasons. I do discuss this more in the book towards the end, so if you need to know, it's there. But there are many reasons. Some of them are political, that the narrative of the Holocaust has been shaped by politics. Some of them are zeitgeist. We've been interested in different elements of the Holocaust at different times during different decades. And some of it is personal. These women didn't tell their story. Or they told it and then they stopped. They weren't believed. They were accused of being collaborate. I heard this all the time. There was this idea that the pure souls perished. But if you survived, it's because you did something to survive. Many of these women felt very, very guilty that they had abandoned their families to be with their group, their underground group, and their families had been killed. Women, like Hasia Bielika was an underground fighter in Białystok. I mean, she started an anti-fascist league where she would get weapons from anti-Nazi Germans and take them herself into the forest and give them to Russian partisans. I mean, incredible stories. And she felt that, compared to her survivor peers who had been through Auschwitz, she said this in a thing, she felt she hadn't had it so bad. She didn't merit sharing this narrative. She felt tremendous survivor's guilt even around that. So,
but you specify it a little bit more because you say if they would have told, or if the story would have spread about the resistance, it would have been kind of blaming the others for not being in the resistance.
So
they took it down in order not to sort of put blame and report.
I actually think that's a more contemporary concern. I think that's been a more recent concern, that when people write about this subject, they're very sensitive about that, that if you write about people who actively fought in this underground, what about people that didn't? Are you accusing them of not having done
But that didn't stop you. Why?
Well, because I'm telling this story. Also, like my grandparents were survivors. They didn't fight in an underground, and I love my Bubby and Zadie with my whole being. My Bubby's the strongest person I know. I mean, she's no longer living, but so I don't know. I didn't feel. I also feel like people resisted, and I talk about this a bit. People. They're academics, they fight about what's really resistance, what's resilience, what's resistance, what's defiance, I don't know. I didn't even care. People resisted in so many ways. Some of them, I didn't tell you, Neuschattel, went out and was an assassin and shot Gestapo men in the head. And other people told jokes. That was also illegal. It was illegal to tell jokes against Hitler. And I found whole shows of jokes from the Warsaw Ghetto. There were many different ways that people defied. One person wrote, staying alive was resistance. If all the Jews were meant to be killed, if you didn't, that you resisted the Nazis. So there are many forms of defiance.
This is a question that I think is the last one. I don't know, because I'll come up with something else as well. We started this discussion, you described yourself and I helped you, saying you were a very anxious person. And you said, does this connect with the Holocaust legacy? I make it two questions. Are you less anxious now And did it relate to the Holocaust legacy?
No and no.
No, no.
No and yes. No,
Just
yeah,
as
no,
anxious.
no, no.
Just as anxious.
I'm definitely just as anxious, but what I feel that this work has made me rethink a little bit. I went into this, as I said, I was thinking about the trauma in my family, the way trauma passes in generations. I was very focused on that. But what I think coming out of this, I think like not only does trauma pass between generations, but so does strength and courage and daring and gumption and passion and compassion. And so I'm trying to hold those both.
Is there another kind of balance in your life after having dived into these stories and come up with the book?
Maybe. Maybe.
There's another thing. There's another question. You mentioned when we met the other night that your focus on Poland because your grandparents were from Poland. So, but you came out of this work with a different idea of Poland, Polish resistance, and not just the role of these women in the resistance, but of other Poles helping them. How is your picture now, your idea now of Poland, post-war Poland, or war Poland and post-war Poland?
Yeah, I think that again, this is like another hour conversation. My own relationship to Poland's very complicated, as expected. And I think when I was growing up, Poland was the villain. I mean, don't speak Polish, don't talk about Poland. The sense of betrayal and anger in my family and in my community, there was a very negative feeling about Poland, and understandably so. But working on this book actually made me much more sympathetic to the Polish experience during World War II. When, as I was saying, Bela Hazan was caught, when Lanka was caught, when Renia was caught, they were caught as Polish women, not as Jews. And they were so brutally tortured, not as Jews, as Catholic Poles. And that opened up my own compassion and sympathy to understand that, the Polish people, the Christian people, also suffered very much in this.
Do you have any idea if your book has changed the idea of Poland and Polish relations in your community as well? Not just your view has changed. Have you helped changing the idea of Polish resistance or Poles in your community as well? Or is it just you?
I
don't know.
I don't know.
Or it's too big question?
I don't know, and it's complicated. There were many Polish collaborators. There were, it wasn't a clear cut. There are people who helped and people who really didn't help, and But I've tried to be more understanding of as a people how they felt at that time.
The absolutely last question I put, maybe you have some question, is the title of the book. In English, it's The Light of Days. And it's the Swedish is Våra, Dagars, which is slightly different. Where does the title come from? Your title, the English title.
So there's a few answers to that too, but as you can see, I always have many answers. Finding a title for this book was very difficult. Everything I suggested, my American publisher was, rejected, terrible, the worst. I mean, like any title was awful. And there were lists of words I was allowed to use and words I wasn't allowed to use, and there was discussion around how Jewish the title could be, and I wasn't allowed to use the word ghetto in the title because in the American context, the ghetto has a different meaning. I had originally called it the Ghetto Girls, and that was not allowed. So there was a lot of discussion, both poetic and political and marketing around the title, and I was failing terribly. And then my editor and I were talking, and she said, why don't we look at poems, poetry, song? And so we started looking at some Holocaust poems and some also early Israeli poems. And then I remembered that Yiddish book that I found back in the British Library had some poems in it.
Freud in the Ghetto.
Yes. So I went back to Freud in the Ghettos, and I started translating the poems. And one of the poems was written by a young Jewish woman. There were poetry contests in the ghettos. And this was the winning submission for the poetry contest, and it was written by a Jewish girl, a teenager, in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the gist of this stanza was, right now Warsaw is decimated, but one day again, it will see the light of days. And look, I'm verklempt already. That felt right in my own ways. This is a dark story, but it is also hopeful. And because it was written by a young woman, and I don't know, it just felt right. And then at the same time, also many of these women were in the underground, and for periods of time, they were stuck underground. And they write so movingly to me about craving sunlight, about how they hope they will live long enough to see the sun one more time. And that also really moved me. So there's something about the light of days that felt right.
It moves us, I can tell you. Thank you for coming to Stockholm as
Thank you.
Judy Batalion. Judy Batalion. Wow.